Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait for around 5 minutes before we formally start.
So is my background okay?
Yes, Professor. Perfect.
Hi, Dr. Howe. Yeah, it looks
Yes,
great.
it's good.
Yeah, I thought you might be interested in this conference as well. It's going to be open access for everybody. So as it's to do with both Koreas as well as Southeast Asia, I thought you might be interested.
Yeah, if you have a poster of that one, you can send it to probably Dr. Bay so we could formally announce it
Okay.
to interested scholars in the country.
Sure.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. I wish I was there in person, but best I can manage.
Yeah.
Okay, what time are you going to start? Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, Ron, we could hear you.
Okay.
Well, I'm ready to go whenever necessary. But you said you wanted to give people a little more time to join.
Okay. Yes, and maybe we can also practice slides of Dr. Howe.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Dr. Howe, how do you pronounce your first and last name?
Brendan Howe.
Brendan Howe. Okay. Okay. So I think we can start in a minute. So we're gonna start at 1:07. So people can still join. Yep. We're gonna start at 1:07. As of now, we have 20 audience. Okay, I think we can start now. 안녕하세요. Magandang hapon po. Good afternoon to all of you. Uh, from yesterday, Korea is celebrating a holiday called Chuseok. So first, before we start, I would like to greet everyone a happy Chuseok or Pungsohan Hankawi Tegil Baramnida. I am Ronel Laranjo, your moderator for today. Welcome to the third Philippine Koreanist Congress. For this year, we are conducting it virtually because of the current situation. To open our Congress, let's hear the opening message of the OIC Director of the UP Korea Research Center, Dr. Aldrin Lee.
Thank you very much, Ron Paksanim. 여러분 안녕하세요. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. 3 years ago, the UP Korea Research Center held the first ever Philippine Koreanist Congress with the theme Building Ties, Fostering Collaborations, with the goal of providing a unifying venue for the Korean studies community in the Philippines. Building upon the success of the first edition, we organized the second Philippine Koreanist Congress and held it in August last year at Novotel with the theme Mapping Korean Diaspora in the Philippines. The second Philippine Koreanist Congress turned out to be one of the biggest and the most successful events that the center has held thus far. As a matter of fact, the Academy of Korean Studies, our continuing sponsor for this event, has rendered an excellent evaluation for this particular project. Inspired by these two equally fruitful past editions, the UPKRC decided to hold the third Philippine Koreanist Congress with the theme Revisiting Diversity and Multiculturalism in Contemporary Korea, Trans-Border Relations and Policy Implications. This theme was motivated by the growing interest among Koreanists in the Philippines in the current affairs of South Korea, particularly in terms of the issues involving the Korean Peninsula, the North and the South relations, and trans-border political issues. We initially intended to hold this event in a proper conference venue, just like the first two editions, since the Koreanist Congress, aside from providing a venue for academic enrichment, has also been an opportunity for scholars in the country studying Korea to personally interact and initiate various forms of collaboration. Unfortunately, due to these challenging circumstances that we are in right now, we could not do the same. But I'm glad that we're still able to push through with this annual gathering. And while our interactions will be purely virtual, I am hoping that you will still find the discussions insightful and participate as much as you can in our opening session today, as well as in the other conversations scheduled in the next 3 weeks. As you have probably seen in our announcements, this year's Koreanist Congress in the Philippines will be held in the first 4 Friday afternoons of this month, from today, October 2, until October 23rd. Today, we are extremely honored to have Dr. Brendan Howe from the Graduate School of International Studies of Ewha University, who will deliver the keynote lecture. In the next 3 weeks, we'll be featuring plenary lectures of 6 distinguished scholars who will be presenting on topics related to this year's overarching theme. We would like to express our gratitude to them for their time and expertise and for agreeing to do their lectures online. Before we formally open today's session, allow me to thank the Academy of Korean Studies, who provided us grant to organize this year's Philippine Koreanist Congress. AKS was also our funder in the first two editions of the conference. I would like to thank the UPKRC organizing team, headed by Dr. Ewha, for providing us with the opportunity to host this event. I would also like to thank the UPKRC organizing team, headed by Dr. Ewha, for providing us with the opportunity to host this event. I would also like to thank the UPKRC organizing team, headed by Dr. Ewha, for providing us with the opportunity to host this event. I would also like to thank the UPKRC organizing team, headed by Dr. Ewha, for providing us with the opportunity to host this event.
Okay, I think we lost Dr. Ald. He will come back later. So thank you for that um, uh, for that message. So introduce the UP Korea Research Center briefly. UPKRC or Korea Research Center was launched on April 27, 2016, aiming to provide Filipino scholars teachers with opportunities to widen their interest in Korean studies. UPKRC holds various academic and cultural activities for Filipino scholars and profession, and serves as a university-wide hub that will help promote and develop Korea studies in the country. For more information or updates, visit www.facebook.com/UPKRC. As what Sir Aldrin said, this Philippine Koreanist Congress differs from the previous two Congress as this will be conducted month-long. Every Friday, we will be hearing different talks related to our team. Our team is entitled Visiting Diversity and Multiculturalism in Contemporary Korea, Transborder Relations and Policy Implications. So let me start the aim of this uh, conference or lectures. One of the significant phenomena in recent Korean society, flow of North Korean defectors. The number has been steadily increasing since mid-1990s due to worsening starvation problem in North Korea. In cultural context, issues involving these defectors are discussed in the lens of multiculturalism. But some argue that integration of defectors in North Korean society looks at in different perspectives. The process South Korean society has become to embrace defectors and accept broader diversity so that this will be integral part of moving forward to reunification process. Through the Third Philippine Koreanist Congress, we hope to deepen our understanding about the current affairs in the Korean Peninsula and discuss relevant issues in two Koreas, their people, and prospects in various academic domains. The first lecture for the Third Philippine Koreanist Congress will be given by Dr. Brandon Howe. Dr. Brandon is Professor of International Relations and Associate Dean of the Graduate School of International Studies, Ewha Women's University. He has held visiting professorship and research fellowships at the Freie Universität Berlin, University of Sydney, East-West Center in Honolulu, Georgian University, University Malaysia, Sarawak, and Beijing Studies University. His ongoing research agendas focus on traditional security in East Asia, human security, middle powers, public diplomacy, and post-crisis development. He has authored and edited more than 90 related publications. He was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, PhD in Political Science, University of Kent at Canterbury, MA in International Conflict Analysis, and the University of Oxford, BA and MA in Modern History. Let's now hear Dr. Brandon Howe's lecture entitled North Korean Refugee Integration Policy in South Korea.
Well, thank you all for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I wish I could be there in person, but this is the best we can do under these challenging conditions. So I'm very impressed that you've managed to find a workaround to still have your conference, which is more than many other associations have managed. I'm going to apologize in advance for my PowerPoint slides. I'm conscious of presenting to an expert Philippine association, and I know from all my Philippine colleagues and students that you're much better at PowerPoint than I am. So I do apologize, it's going to be very basic in terms of the PowerPoint. I'd also like to make a comment about the background behind me. That is a conference that's going to be held at National University of Singapore, but again, it'll be a virtual conference. But they've encouraged me to invite everybody to attend. And given that the subject is related to the two Koreas and Southeast Asia, I figure that some of you might be interested in that. I'd also like to mention the Asian Political and International Studies Association and the Korea International Studies Association. I'm sure many of you are members of one or both of those already, but I would encourage everyone to friend these associations on Facebook. Doesn't cost you anything, and you get announcements about jobs, about publications, about conferences. In fact, APISA and KISA will be jointly hosting an online conference in November, to which you're all invited. So, anything else I've forgotten? Yes, one other thing. My journal, the Asian International Studies Review, currently, if you go to aisr.org, you can download 20 years of articles for free. However, starting next year, this journal will be published with Brill International Publishers. So unfortunately, there will be no more freebies. So I encourage everyone to go and take advantage of what's being offered before the end of the year. So moving on, I'm going to see if I can share a screen here. Where are we? Okay. So does that come up for everybody? Good. So
Yes, it's good.
Yep. So of course, North Korean refugees are a major issue for the Korean Peninsula, but also indeed for neighboring countries. And in fact, refugee crises are among the gravest governance challenges facing global governance, regional governance, as well as national governance. The impact of refugee flows are currently felt in every inhabited continent on the planet. But I would argue that North Korean refugees pose a particular problem, maybe a unique problem, due to three intersecting elements of governance. First, we have the fact that Asian governments are still pretty Westphalian in their approach. They're very state-centric in their governance models, and indeed even international organizations in this region have not adapted to human-centered models of governance so far. Secondly, in Korea, despite the fact, South Korea, despite the fact we have a fairly large and growing international population, I think we're up to about 2.5 million now. Still, the self-perception in South Korea is of an ethnically homogenous society. And thirdly, with respect to North Korean refugees themselves, they're actually in a uniquely privileged position of being guaranteed South Korean citizenship by the Constitution. So the interplay of these three variables has generated a specific set of governance challenges and obligations for the Republic of Korea government, but also opportunities and vulnerabilities for North Korean refugees in South Korea. So we're going to look at how these develop over time. So this presentation is going to first of all look at the nature of refugee crises and Asian governance. Then we're going to move through what's currently being done in South Korea in terms of protecting the human security of refugees, including the process of integration and the support systems that are being offered in South Korea for North Korean refugees. Then we're going to look at the changing nature of North Korean refugees, especially in terms of demographics, and how these impose new challenges for the government of South Korea. And finally, we'll address implications and policy prescriptions that I would like to make, in fact, I am making to the South Korean government, that maybe they can act on these to improve the status of North Korean refugees in South Korea. So the number of North Korean refugees, as was mentioned in the introduction, has in recent years continued to grow, but actually only between 1998 and 2012 did we have a steady increase in the number of North Korean refugees. Since Kim Jong-un came to power in Pyongyang, we've actually had a reduction in the number of North Korean refugees. We've also had a change in the reasons why North Koreans are fleeing North Korea. Initially, it was because of political opposition to the regime. During the 1990s, most fled because of the food crisis in North Korea. Then more recently, it's more common for North Korean refugees, when they're interviewed upon arrival in South Korea, to say that they fled because they desire a better quality of life for themselves, but also a better future for their families. So the prime motivation is shifting from the absolute desperation of starvation to instead aspirations for a better life. This can be a little problematic because it potentially jeopardizes their categorization as refugees. Because refugees, you're supposed to be in imminent fear for your life and limb, rather than acting under more economic impulses for migration. Refugees can, however, depend on international governance legislation to invoke their rights of substitution protection in any state that's party to the Refugee Convention, because their human security is so gravely endangered, not only in North Korea, but if they escape and then are returned to North Korea, they are faced with very severe penalties. So that means there are two main categories of North Korean refugee: those who fled North Korea for fear of political persecution, and those who fled North Korea for other reasons, such as searching for food, but now who fear persecution if they're returned to North Korea. So both these categories qualify under the Refugee Convention as refugees. We also have domestic legal protection, in that the Constitution of the Republic of Korea provides South Korean nationality to all Koreans born on the Korean Peninsula, whether in North Korea or South Korea. And in 1996, the Supreme Court of South Korea ruled that North Koreans have automatic South Korean nationality. Their privileged constitutional position provides North Korean escapees with many advantages in South Korea, certainly when compared with refugees from other countries. But this is also potentially an obstacle for refugee protection in third countries, because if they're guaranteed South Korean citizenship, then other countries may feel that they do not have to give them refugee protection because they're assumed to be citizens of South Korea. And so therefore they're not in danger in South Korea, so they don't qualify as refugees. Furthermore, while citizenship is automatically granted upon arrival, and North Korean refugees receive resettlement funds, apartments, lots of other help, this does not necessarily mean that the North Korean refugees, when they reach South Korea, have actually reached the end of their arduous journey. They still face a number of challenges. So South Korea had signed the Refugee Convention in 1993 and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment in 1994. Both of these are important because they contain the principle of non-refoulement, the prohibition of compulsory repatriation. And so these are, given that North Korean refugees, if they were to be repatriated to North Korea, would certainly face cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment. That's why this is also important subsidiary measures for South Korean government to act on. The South Korean government bases the current resettlement approach for North Korean refugees on its North Korean Refugees Protection and Settlement Act, which was enacted in 1997. And this included a number of practical policies, such as recognition of North Korean educational qualifications, a provision for social adaptation education, job training, and so on. In addition, in 1997, the managing headquarters for refugee programs changed from the Ministry of Health and Welfare to the Ministry of Unification. So here we start seeing South Korean government appreciating the role that North Korean refugees can play in promoting reunification of the Korean Peninsula. So North Korean refugees, at least in theory, are seen as partners for unification. Recent integration policies were developed as long-term plans. In fact, we have two long plans. The first settlement support plan for North Korean refugees ran from 2015 to 2017, and the second settlement support plan for North Korean refugees from 2018 to 2020. So the process of how North Koreans go about getting to South Korea and how the South Korean government deals with them. Well, first of all, the requests for protection and transfer are made usually in third-party countries, so Southeast Asia in particular. Thailand, I think, is about 95% of South Korean refugees are currently processed through Thailand. But anyway, the reports of these requests and the conditions are related to the relevant ministries. The defectors are accommodated in the foreign diplomatic offices or temporary shelters in the host countries as they're transitioning to get to South Korea. After verifying the identity, the South Korean government then negotiates with the host country to support immigration to South Korea. After entry to South Korea, there's joint questioning by relevant organizations, in particular the National Intelligence Service of South Korea, who are very keen to weed out any potential North Korean infiltrators. And then there's a decision whether to protect the defectors through the Association of Supporters for the Settlement of North Korean Refugees. Assuming that they get past this process, they're then transferred to Hanawon, which is the refugee processing center. There, refugees undergo social adaptation education spread over 12 weeks of over 390 hours of education. Also included in this, psychological stabilization, promotion of an understanding of South Korean society, basic vocational training, and so on. Then they're prepared to move out of Hanawon and move into their new accommodation in South Korea. And they continue to have support for another 5 years, including job-seeking support, employment support, vocational training, qualification, etc., asset building. Lots of help is given to them to help them integrate into South Korean society. So after completing their program at Hanawon, North Korean refugees are provided with houses in which to live and additional training supported by the 25 Hana centers spread out throughout South Korea. So this support includes an initial amount of money depending on conditions and size of the household who are defecting, ranging between 8 million and 39 million won, which in dollars would be, what would that be, about $6,500 to about $30,000. They also are enrolled in basic living security elements, so livelihood benefits, medical care, pension, and so on. Vocational support includes an employment subsidy, job training costs, incentives for employment, asset building assistance. Also, there's quite a lot of educational support for North Korean refugees, and indeed my university, Ewha Women's University, has quite a large number of refugees receiving this educational support, which includes a tuition waiver for middle and high schools and national and public universities, and a 50% tuition grant for private universities. There's also ongoing counseling and security support where professional counselors continue to work with North Korean refugees in South Korea to help them adapt, and the ongoing housing subsidy to arrange for permanent rental of apartments. So, not surprising, there has been, by a number of measurements, considerable progress as a result of these policies and reforms. And indeed, it seems when you ask North Korean refugees, it would seem that they're quite happy with the amount of support they're given. So 75% of North Korean refugees express satisfaction with their lives in South Korea, with only 3.8% dissatisfied with their lives in Korea. So not only do North Korean refugees receive the same legal status as South Koreans, they also benefit from additional assistance programs. Despite this support, however, North Korean refugees continue to experience hardships, and there are a number of problems related to marginalization. So we had to be very careful with this 75% of North Korean refugees saying they're very happy with their lives in South Korea, and only 3.8% dissatisfied. Because first of all, given the absolute challenges to their human security in North Korea, they're starting from such a low base of expectation that any improvement in their lives is going to be a significant improvement on previously. So their judgment is likely to be colored by this increase in their well-being. Secondly, there may be an element of unwillingness on the part of North Korean refugees to criticize the South Korean government. Thirdly, even though the avowed goal of South Korean policies is to enable North Korean refugees to achieve self-reliability and self-sustainability, most of the current benefits are actually offered in terms of material services such as monetary compensation and in-kind benefits, rather than actually building North Koreans into a position where they can self-sustain. So not only as a result of this is refugee autonomy and identity impacted, but also the perception of North Korean refugees is negatively impacted amongst the wider South Korean society. As a result of this, therefore, fourth, we have the ongoing negative perception of refugees within South Korea. And I would say that the fifth major challenge is the failure of the South Korean government policies to adjust to the changing demographics of the North Korean refugee population. So if you look at the graph here of the demographics, most apparently the number of female North Korean refugees has increased dramatically as a proportion of total numbers. In 2002, that was the first year that the proportion exceeded 55%. But by 2019, we're up to 72% of North Korean refugees are female. Second, the serious food and chronic economic crisis in North Korea resulted in a change in the nature of North Korean refugees. That increasingly we have far more ordinary North Korean citizens attempting the hazardous journey rather than just elites that are escaping because they disagree with the government. So most recently, the most recent survey, we have 33% 38.5% of refugees were previously employed as workers or farmers, 46.9%, so almost 47%, unemployed or otherwise not involved in economic activities. Only 5.2% in recent years were college graduates, a much lower number than that in the 1990s, where a lot of the people that were able to formulate escape plans were the better educated in North Korea. Finally, there's been a marked change in the reasons given by North Korean refugees to leave for the South. Prior to 1990, mainly for personal and political reasons. In the 1990s, starvation. More recently, the reasons, however, have been much more diverse. So over 25%, because I hated being monitored and controlled by the North Korean regime. 22.5% related to food shortages, and 12.5% in order to provide my family with a better living environment. So we got a change in the motivation for North Korean refugees to come to South Korea, but also we have a dramatic change in the makeup of North Korean refugees, that now we have a large increase in the number of vulnerable, less educated, and skill deficient escapees who are going to find it harder to get jobs in South Korea. So if we look in detail at the challenges faced by North Korean refugees in South Korea, first of all, if we think about what is the contemporary archetypal North Korean refugee? Well, based on these statistics, we can say that they're likely to be female, more likely to be unskilled or with comparatively little education, escaping severe hardship, of course, because everyone's escaping severe hardship in North Korea, but also likely to have encountered more hardship while transiting through China and Southeast Asian countries, aspiring to a better life for themselves and their families in South Korea. So a lot of the old policies may not be appropriate now for the contemporary North Korean refugee. Their expectations for their new lives in South Korea are relatively high, and this may also contribute to unhappiness as a result of an expectancy gap, when hopes are far from being matched by reality. Indeed, we've actually seen some North Koreans commit suicide, but also some North Korean refugees try to defect back to North Korea. Indeed, while significantly better than the living standards that they fled in North Korea, the quality of life for North Korean refugees remains somewhat lower than the South Korean average. The employment rate for North Korean refugees is 60.4%, almost exactly the same as for South Koreans, which is 60.9%. But the types of jobs and the working conditions carried out by those resettled are comparatively unfavorable. 22.5% of North Korean refugees work in unskilled positions. 18.1% are service workers. 11.7% are equipment, machine operating, and assembling workers. Only 11% of North Korean refugees hold professional positions. That's compared with 20.5% of South Koreans. The unemployment rate is also nearly double that of South Koreans at 6.9%. So to be granted citizenship and benefits in South Korea does not equate to full integration for North Korean refugees. North Korean refugees are a minority, just like other minorities. And as a result, they can still face group discrimination against them as minorities. According to Seoul National University's Institute for Peace and Unification Studies, there's been an increase in negative sentiments about North Korean refugees in South Korea. In 2019, the most recent year that we have data for, their survey found that the answer, accept all those who want to come to South Korea, fell below 30% for the first time since the survey began. Increasing from the previous years, 14.3% said that North Korean refugees should no longer be accepted in South Korea. And 56% of respondents, the highest ever number for since the survey began, said that should be optional acceptance. So under some conditions, North Korean refugees should be accepted, but not always. The negative attitudes towards North Korean refugees can be seen as a result of South Korea's economic recession, socioeconomic polarization, especially since what were termed the IMF reforms, the major liberalizing of the South Korean economy. High unemployment rate, well, not compared with many other countries, but certainly for South Korea, the current unemployment rate is significantly higher than they used to. So North Korean refugees are increasingly seen as potentially an economic burden and certainly as potential competition for what jobs are available. And there are concerns, of course, that they will drive down wages and working conditions through competition. So although North Korean refugees have basic rights at the same level as those born in South Korea, they are often socially excluded and discriminated against. North Korean refugees noted in a survey that their chances of being hired are probably 70 to 80% lower than South Koreans. Well, the statistics don't quite bear that out. It's not as bad as the perception. But whether or not that is the actual hiring rate, the important thing is by perceiving the unlikeliness of being hired, refugees could also have a lower self-esteem and a negative outlook of their prospects. Furthermore, North Korean refugees, although they have privileged positions legally compared with other refugee and immigrant groups in South Korea, unlike other migrant groups, they've been asked to separate from their North Korean identity. They have to give up their former identity, and there's something of a forced assimilation into South Korean society. So this can also be traumatic for them. So what do I think we should do about this? Well, if we look at the South Korean government's aspirations, first of all, the South Korean government aims to unify the people of the two Koreas. Successive administrations in Seoul have also further emphasized a human-centric governance perspective. And we see this in the new Northern policy, new Southern policy of the Moon Jae-in administration, and the 100 policy goals of the Moon administration. But the social integration policies, the current social integration policies in South Korea towards North Korean refugees are not achieving these fundamental goals, or at least not fully achieving these fundamental goals. Many South Koreans continue to see North Korean refugees, perceive them negatively, while the refugees themselves live what is by many measures a lower quality of life and face diverse social and economic challenges. So I think that when dealing with the North Korean refugee issue, Seoul needs to prioritize human-centered governance, with a recognition that this means governance in the interest of the most vulnerable. So instead of perceiving North Korean refugees just playing to the high-profile defections, they need to start with the low-profile, the most vulnerable North Korean refugees. So good refugee governance, in particular in the case of North Korean refugees, requires a recognition of the specific vulnerabilities of the refugees, and that their changing demographics also represents an increase in the numbers and proportion of the most vulnerable of this group. To achieve integration goals, not only a stable resettlement system is necessary, but also a change in perception of North Koreans by South Koreans towards the refugees. So programs which aim to increase awareness of the importance of accepting them into South Korean society need to be expanded. Furthermore, in order to reflect the dignity element of human security is freedom from want, freedom from need, but also freedom to live in dignity. There should be a shift in perspective from protecting and supporting refugees as recipients to living together as partners. The current policy prioritization is for North Korean refugees. Well, I would argue that instead the focus should be rather on working with North Korean refugees. We need in South Korea to consider specializing policies for women. Despite the dramatic increase in female refugees, there are very few programs aimed to address hardships unique to them. The first and second settlement support plans have offered little in terms of detailed and specific support programs for women. Lastly, for integration policies to be effective, North Korean refugees must be able to take part in the decision-making process. The current Korea Hana Foundation board, there are 10 members, only 3 of which are North Korean refugees. 2 out of these 3 were only appointed this year. The first North Korean refugee congressman was elected in 2012 through the proportional representation lists rather than to represent a constituency of fellow citizens. Again, in the elections this year, in 2020, 2 North Korean refugees gained seats in the National Assembly, with 1 of them being directly elected. But throughout the election campaigns, there were prominent debates concerning whether North Korean refugees are suitable to serve as the elected representatives of the people to the national legislature. So they're still not considered to be worthy representatives of their fellow citizens who happen to have been born in South Korea rather than North Korea. By participating in the decision-making process, refugees can bring forth ideas and solutions from their own perspectives and experiences. So it's crucial to enable refugees to participate in and have an influence on integration policies. So more needs to be done. More needs to be done in terms of increasing North Korean refugee participation in their own destiny, but also more needs to be done in addressing the needs of the most vulnerable of North Korean refugees, especially as they're now in the majority, and more needs to be done in addressing the specific needs of female North Korean refugees, especially as they are also in the overwhelming majority now. So I think that will be it for me, but I do welcome any questions and I'll do my best to provide any answers to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Howe, for that informative lecture. I'm sure our live audiences from all over the Philippines and even in Korea has some questions in mind. If you have any questions, please type them in our YouTube chat box, live chat box, and we will read them later after we hear our discussion. Again, please type your questions in our YouTube live chat box. Kindly use hashtag UPKRC, again, hashtag UPKRC and hashtag 3 PKC, hashtag 3PKC when you post something in your Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and other social media sites. Our discussion for today is Dr. Jed Rabena. Dr. Aaron Jed Rabena is a research fellow at the University of the Philippines, Korea Research Center, and the Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress, a foreign policy think tank. Let's hear it from Sir Jed.
Hello, am I clear?
Yes.
Professor Ron, yeah, thank you very much for your introduction. Professor Brandon Howe, sir, Professor Kyumin Bay, Professor Alden Lee, good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to be the discussant to the keynote address of Professor Howe. I'm very honored and delighted. So before I guess throw some questions to Professor Howe, it was really a very interesting, comprehensive presentation about how North Koreans are currently faring in South Korean society. And to me, before Professor Brandon Howe presented this, I didn't really have much of an idea like how the North Koreans get integrated into South Korean society. But with the presentation of Professor Howe, he actually starts by providing us a background that South Korea continues to face a refugee crisis, and this is because of the divided Korean Peninsula, and even in spite of so I'm just giving a rundown now of Professor Howe's presentation before I give my comments and questions later on. So, and then Professor Howe also mentions that in spite of the Republic of Korea being globalized, you can still see signs and indicators that they're not they're not that receptive yet towards North Korea. There continues to be some issues. So starting with what Professor Howe mentioned, it's good that the North Koreans go through a process of reintegration. And Professor Howe believes that there's actually two types of North Korean defectors. One is that you have the North Korean refugees, and second is that you have the economic migrants. And of course, in the case of the latter, it seems that there's an issue with classifying them as as a refugee, because they're already in search of greener pasture. So Professor Howe provided us a clear picture of the process of reintegrating North Koreans as per the South Korean government's policy of reintegration. First, what happens is that upon arrival in South Korea, so we can see here some sort of a political accommodation by the South Korean government, because they grant citizenship to the North Korean defectors. And apart from that, they also get economic and social assistance. I believe Professor Howe mentioned this to be under the auspices of the Ministry of Unification. So what happens is North Koreans get debriefed, they get counseling, they get education. So there's a wide network of social and economic support that's waiting for them. And apart from that, Professor Howe also mentioned that many North Koreans, I believe over 70%, are satisfied with their lives in South Korea. So it seems that they're loving K-pop, they're loving the South Korean dream. And however, Professor Howe also pointed out that it's not all good, because there are some issues and also challenges. And one of them is the negative perceptions that South Koreans have towards the North Koreans. So I guess in this case, we still see a we they, some sort of a we they mindset. And this leads to the lack of, the North Koreans feel that they're not being fully assimilated, perhaps, into South Korean society. And it's also good to know that most of these defectors, these North Koreans, they used to be workers, farmers, and some of them are unemployed. And I believe Professor Howe mentioned that only 5% of the North Korean defectors are college graduates. So their main reasons for leaving South Korea are basically they want a better living environment. I think I recall that they have they've gotten tired of the North Korean surveillance state, and also because of the very basic thing of food shortage. So many of these North Koreans, many of these defectors, um, actually land in unskilled positions. And also, although there are also those who are able to get professional jobs, but they're a small amount. And so, based on this, I think some I think Professor Howe, I believe Professor Howe mentioned the issue of acceptance. A study, I believe, a study by SNU, Seoul National University, um, uh, found that some South Koreans no longer want a full acceptance of North Korean refugees, and what they just want is, uh, partial acceptance. And this is because of growing burden on South Korean economic resources. And so we see this problem. And I think another major problem is that this one I already mentioned a while ago, but there's also this social exclusion of North Koreans. When they apply for jobs, according to Professor Ho, they're not easily hired. And this is why Professor Ho came up with a policy prescription that which I think in a way is somehow constructivist, because he believes that there needs to be a change in the mindset of South Korean people, in spite of the fact that there already were um, North Korean defectors who were elected as members of the South Korean National Assembly. So I guess to Dr. Ho, what I'd like to ask is, I really enjoyed your presentation, sir. Very informative. And what I'd like to ask is, have you tried to draw some parallels, sir, as to like how West Germany then absorbed Eastern Germany, or how they absorbed Eastern Germans after the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended? And I guess my second question would be, like, is there a trend, Professor? Like if there's a pro-constructive engagement South Korean government, do we see more defectors going into South Korea? And conversely, if there's a South Korean government that is for maximum pressure, do we see less defectors? So that's all for me, sir. And thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Jed. So maybe we can hear from Dr. Howe.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Rabina. Some very interesting points and a couple of good questions. I'm going to respond to a few of the things you said there first before getting to your specific questions. You mentioned that South Korea is facing something of a North Korean refugee crisis. Actually, it's not just a North Korean refugee crisis. It's tied up with a greater issue of soul searching in South Korea. The body politic is very strange in South Korea, that they still have this conceptualization of ethnic homogeneity, but also it's an increasingly liberal society, as seen by the recent stunning election victories of the more liberal party or parties. But liberals in South Korea are somewhat torn, because on the one hand, they certainly adopt all the humanitarian principles of liberalism, and in domestic governance, they're very much in favor of distributive justice, of human rights and things like that. But they're also somewhat nationalistic. That a lot of the liberals are pushing the anti-Japanese agenda, and to a certain extent an anti-American agenda. So the liberals themselves find that they're very torn about how they should treat refugees, whether they be from North Korea or from anywhere else. And they've been, on the whole, they've been very welcoming of North Korean refugees and pushed the agenda that we're all one people. But at the same time, they're conscious of this backlash in society against other refugees. There were some refugees, I think, from Yemen and they were housed in Jeju-do. And there was a big scandal about the money that was spent on them and how they were dangerous, and they're mostly male, not female. So lots of xenophobia crept in there. And there is a danger of this backlash against refugees, that North Korean refugees get caught up in this as well. Now, you mentioned the statistic that 75% of North Korean refugees express satisfaction with their treatment in South Korea, but there are some serious problems with that in terms of self-selection bias. That are the people who are interviewed, do they feel a lot of pressure to express satisfaction? Or are they satisfied because they're comparing it with their old lives rather than in absolute terms? They're looking at it in relative terms. So there's certainly some problems there. You mentioned the problem of assimilation, North Korean assimilation into South Korean society. But there's also the problem that if they are forced to integrate into South Korean society and give up their North Korean identity. So there's a problem with facilitating integration into South Korean society, but also there's the problem with going too far and forcing everyone to give up everything that makes them North Korean. Now, you also mentioned the increasing resistance towards accepting North Korean refugees. Yeah, I think part of this is what I mentioned before, the increased resistance to refugees generally, but also the socioeconomic conditions. Going to your two formal questions. First of all, parallels with the German experience. Actually, I'd say, unfortunately, yes, there are parallels with the German experience. Because if you look at what's happening in Germany, even though this was trumpeted as a tremendous success, actually it hasn't been. If you look at the rise of far-right extremism in Germany, it's predominantly focused in East Germany. So the East Germans have not been integrated into West German liberal democratic traditions to the extent that we would hope. Also, East Germany, former East Germany, sees most of the pockets of poverty in Germany as well. So you still have major socioeconomic disparity between former East Germans and former West Germans. Of course, the refugees coming to South Korea from North Korea are a tiny percentage of the total population. I think, however, we can draw similar parallel lessons that if we look at how South Korean society is treating North Korean refugees, what sort of lesson does this teach us if we do eventually have reunification of the Korean Peninsula? How is North Korea going to be treated by a unified Korean Peninsula governed from Seoul? So I think that what the refugees do give us the opportunity to do is see where the problems are, try to adapt governance policies in order to be prepared for eventual unification. So I think the government really needs to take on board some of these lessons. Your question about the trend of North Korean refugees, does it go up and down dependent on whether it's liberals or conservatives in power in Seoul? Actually, statistically, there seems little evidence of this. But it's not so much the pull factor, it's the push factor from North Korea. So you have increases in refugees when things are particularly bad in North Korea. And why we have a tailing off, however, of North Korean refugees under Kim Jong-un is not because things have got dramatically better in North Korea, it's because they've made it more difficult for people to leave, especially with the increase in COVID restrictions as well. So that the North Koreans under Kim Jong-un have really tightened things up, made it much more difficult for people to leave North Korea. And this is what's triggered a downturn in the number of refugees making it to Seoul, more than anything, I would say. So I hope that addresses your questions, and I welcome more from the audience.
Thank you, Professor Brandon. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So I'll just give you a time to drink some water and rest a bit because we have lots of questions from the audience. So I will be sharing the questions through the PowerPoint, so it will be easier for us to understand the questions. Are you ready, Professor?
Yes, I'm good to go.
Okay, so the first question, aside from the financial assistance for North Korean refugees, is there also a psychological assistance for them from the government, of course, considering that SK is a completely different environment?
Do you want me to answer question by question, or are we going to take a few questions and then I'll answer them?
Maybe we can just, you can answer right away. So,
okay. So yes, there are actually 5 years of psychological assistance, or potentially for 5 years, they can receive assistance as part of the ongoing protection and integration programs. How effective that is, I don't know. I think because they're not specifically tailored to the needs of the most vulnerable, I'm not sure how effective they've been. I mean, obviously 5 years of assistance is better than nothing, but I do think that more needs to be done, not only in terms of psychological assistance, but also at a society level in terms of empowering former refugees to become productive members of South Korean society.
okay, that's good. Next. What lessons do you think that the ASEAN can learn from the North and South Korean refugee integration, especially there is an ongoing refugee crisis in Myanmar regarding the Rohingya refugees?
Right. Well, actually, as you can see from my backdrop, I'll be speaking at another conference which is specifically related to this. So I do encourage people to tune in for that. My presentation will be looking at the human security challenges for North Korean refugees in North Korea, in ASEAN, and in South Korea. So you've just heard the South Korean bit so far today. But certainly I'm very well aware of other refugee crises in the East Asian region, by which I mean Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And I think what we can learn from South Korean integration policies, both good and bad, is the need to focus on the most vulnerable. That first of all, you have to address the threats to their existence, so physical threats. Secondly, you have to address the material well-being. But thirdly, you do have to address their dignity. So I think a human security focus is the way forward for ASEAN. ASEAN has been somewhat resistant. The ASEAN way has been somewhat resistant to focusing on individuals and groups rather than focusing on states. This is part of the Westphalian tradition of East Asia. But I think we need to look at how we can provide these three aspects of human security for all refugees. Now, I have done some work with Rohingya as well, and it was expressed to me one of the biggest problems they face is identity-related problem. That some have been in refugee camps in Bangladesh or in Malaysia for many years, and during that time they're offered lots of training programs, but they can't be offered, for instance, a university degree, because to enroll in any university, I can't think of any university in this world that you can enroll in if you don't have a citizenship, and they don't have citizenships. So, of course, one thing that South Korea did straight away for North Koreans is give them the right of citizenship. Now, I don't anticipate that other ASEAN countries are going to give Rohingya refugees instant citizenship in their countries. But what we need to do is look at the barriers to participation caused by this lack of citizenship. So is there a way that we can allow refugees to register for university degrees even if they do not have citizenship? So one of the ways we're looking at doing that is through blockchain technology. That we're finding ways in which refugees can be vouched for by their peers as to what their identity is, and therefore they can then be granted some form of formal identity which will allow them to open bank accounts, get mobile phones, as well as enroll in universities. So identity is vitally important for refugees in terms of their human security. And really, that's an area that South Korea has done a good job, and at least they've immediately recognized North Korean refugees as citizens.
Okay. Just a follow-up question regarding that. So, as you also said in your lecture that North Koreans are automatically granted as South Korean citizenship, right? When they are in South Korea. What if they opt out? They opt out for that. Like they still carry their North Korean citizenship. Is it because it's still connected with the multiculturalism that we are talking to, right? Because like in Korea, multiculturalism actually began with the influx of the marriage migrants and also the laborers, and then the refugees, as you've said, they take account these refugees as multicultural families too. So essentially, they can be also North Koreans as on their own rights, right? So is there a option for North Koreans to retain their citizenship?
No, simple answer. And this
Okay.
is also problematic.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think this has caused significant trauma for North Korean refugees. This is an area where South Korea is not doing so well. I'm not sure whether you could ever allow them to retain their North Korean citizenship, but you could certainly allow them to retain a degree of North Korean identity. And really that there isn't any mechanism for supporting that. South Korea actually has very good programs now for supporting other groups from other countries, whether they be refugees or whether it be marriage migrants or economic migrants, whatever it may be. There's quite a lot of support in terms of language classes, in terms of financial support, cultural support. Multiculturalism of other cultures is encouraged in South Korea.
Yeah.
It's just North Korean that's not. So that
Yeah.
is a specific ongoing challenge for North Korean refugees. Most ways North Korean refugees are better off than refugees from other countries. That's one area that they're not.
Okay, so let's proceed to the next question. In light of the recent actions of saber rattling by Pyongyang, how do you think this will affect your recommendations for increased North Korean involvement and participation? Also, like recently, President Moon also talked to the UN, and then like he also mentioned about the lasting peace in the the Korea Peninsula, and he wants to officially end the war because technically they are still in war these days. So yeah, in relation to this question too.
Well, obviously we have two separate but closely related questions here. One is the treatment of North Korean refugees or former refugees. How can we increase their involvement and participation in South Korean society? But secondly, how does this relate to engagement with North Korea? I'm actually an advocate of both, that I think we need to increase the involvement and participation of North Korean refugees in South Korea, but also we need to look for ways in which we can increase involvement, participation, and interaction with North Korea. Now, if we actually celebrate North Korean cultural identity in South Korea, I think that will help ease relations with North Korea. And I think it's important to not draw the line against North Korean participation in anything, because it's only through interacting with them that there's a hope for a degree of socialization of the North Korean regime. So if this is one way in which we can improve this, under a former liberal administration in Seoul, the Nomu-yun administration, there was actually a proposal for maybe opening a branch of a South Korean university in Pyongyang. And actually that university was my university, Ewha Women's University, because it's non-threatening. A women's university is not going to be a direct challenge to the status quo in Pyongyang, but it's certainly an avenue for the socialization, for changing perceptions in North Korea. So I think we need to explore any of these soft or low politic areas to increase cooperation and reduce the saber rattling in North Korea. One area where North Koreans have actually been quite receptive in terms of international cooperation and allowed NGOs to operate in North Korea is actually disabled rights and disabled access to buildings and things like that. So I think it's good if we look at what we can do for the most vulnerable, the human security of the most vulnerable, whether they be North Korean refugees in South Korea or the most vulnerable sections of North Korean society, not only because it's in the interest of these vulnerable people, but also because of the non-threatening cooperation that such activities instill.
Okay, so let's go to the next question. And how does the Korean government handle cases of sexual abuse of North Korean female refugees and in their transit to a third party country or to South Korea? And then I think this is also related to the sexual harassment by the embassy of Korea in like New Zealand, and also the one here in the Philippines. So maybe it's also related to that issue.
Well, I think one of the problems is that the South Korean policy towards North Korean refugees doesn't take enough notice of the specific vulnerabilities of female refugees. I mean, they should do it anyway because they're among the most vulnerable groups, but especially now that they're in such a large majority of the refugees are actually women. South Korea does not have a very good gendered policy towards North Korean refugees. A lot of the work that's done to support them and rescue them from conditions of sexual slavery, for instance, in third-party countries, is carried out by NGOs.
Yeah.
And I think the South Korean government really needs to reach out more, even if they have to do it through NGOs, to try to increase the security, the human security of vulnerable women and girls.
The North Koreans are just taken care of by the government once they reach the embassy, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like regarding to the from transitioning or like going from North Korea or escaping from North Korea and maybe going to China or Mongolia or other third party, and then when they reach the time they reach the South Korean embassy in any country, that's the only time the government intervenes, right?
Yeah.
And mostly in that channel, mostly it's individualized and non-governmental organization.
Yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah.
think that makes it clear. And then next question, I'd like to ask if there's a data or study showing the number of North Korean refugees that has finished college degrees in South Korea, and is the South Korean government still check up on the refugees after 5 years?
There is some data on number of North Korean refugees that have finished college. I actually don't have that data, but I'm aware that there is data for undergraduate degrees, because all North Korean refugees have these subsidized opportunities for their university study. And so the government keeps record of the subsidies they pay. So yes, there is a record of North Korean refugees studying for undergraduate degrees and graduating with those degrees. There isn't, however, any data on graduate students. Because I know this for a fact, because I was actually looking for data on graduate students as part of the education project, and it's not available because graduate students are not subsidized by the government, so they don't bother keeping records on that. Probably we'd have to go university to university to ask, but then of course you have privacy issues as well. So yeah, we can't get data on that, but yes, there is data on South Korea, on undergraduates, but I don't have that to hand. Does the South Korean government still check up on refugees after 5 years? Not really. At the moment, there's support for 5 years of security and health and care, and then pretty much they're on their own. I mean, again, there's still some civil society elements that do continue to help North Koreans after 5 years, but the official government programs run for 5 years.
Okay, thank you for that. And next questions. North Korean refugees to help in reunification efforts. That's an interesting prospect. Are there any North Korean refugees who are of a stature high enough to wield influence on North Korea and South Korea issue?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, there are currently, we had 2 North Koreans elected in the most recent election, and we had 1 previously. Also, there are some fairly high-profile defectors who contribute to the discussions. Unfortunately, those who have defected and reach a high enough level to influence the North Korea-South Korea issue tend to be very hostile towards North Korea. And they also tend to be closely allied with the conservative political parties in South Korea. So as a result, the conservative parties generally do not engage with North Korea. And so the high-level defectors are with the conservative policies, so that they almost self-exclude themselves from helping the North Korea-South Korea issue. I think it'd be much more useful if they are part of the liberal administrations that do attempt to engage with North Korea more. But at the moment, yeah, what influence they have tends to be a negative influence at the moment.
Okay, two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, there were some incidents when North Korean defectors to South Korea have returned or attempted cross border, while South Korean authority was rather unaware of these incidents. This is not expected, but do you think South Korea may impose strict rules or screenings for prospect defectors or refugees?
Yeah, the attempts at redefection, it seems in most cases, it was because of unhappiness with their lives in South Korea, unexpected unhappiness. So increased screening wouldn't help. Increased care of conditions would help. The ones where it wasn't because of unhappiness, they actually made the case that they were forced to defect when they were working for North Korean restaurants in third-party countries, and then their bosses the whole group of them defected, or their dance troupes or whatever. That in that case, yeah, maybe better screening would help if they were able to express, no, actually, I didn't want to defect in the first place, and then you could just send them back. But yeah, I think that screening, there's already a pretty rigorous screening. They have 12 weeks of screening before they're released into the general public. So I think they're reasonably good at uncovering people who are not genuine defectors. The problem with redefection is usually because of a dissatisfaction with their lives in South Korea.
Okay. And how do you see neighboring countries such as ASEAN states, China, and others work with South Korean government hand in hand to improve North Korean refugees' condition and status?
Well, frankly, unfortunately, in many cases, it's getting worse. China has increasingly sided with the North Korean position, even though China is actually a signatory to the Refugee Convention, one of the few states in the region that is. China doesn't consider North Korean refugees to be refugees, and so doesn't hesitate to deport them back to North Korea. And other ASEAN states have actually also come under a lot of pressure from North Korea to align with the North Korean position. So Vietnam used to be the major conduit for North Korean refugees to come to South Korea. But the North Korean government highlighted one particularly large group of North Korean refugees and complained bitterly to the Vietnamese government. And as a result, the Vietnamese government is no longer cooperating in bringing North Korean refugees to South Korea. Cambodia has a relatively small number of refugees, and that's because you have to transit through other countries to get there. And they're also fairly closely allied with the North Korean position. Same Laos, there's a lot of hardship in going through Laos, but the least preferred route is through Myanmar because of the dangerous terrain, the dangers of conflict in Myanmar, and the high probability of being arrested in Myanmar, as well as facing these other human security challenges. So the preferred destination for most North Korean refugees, if they can possibly make it, is Thailand. But of course, Thailand doesn't have a land border with China. So they have to go through other countries to get to Thailand anyway. And so usually what they try to do is go through the Golden Triangle, cross the Mekong down into Thailand that way. But it's pretty hazardous. The South Korean government has actually lent on Thailand a great deal to keep this avenue open. Also, I think the South Korean government has worked quite closely with Mongolian government. But they've got to be very careful in revealing the extent to which anyone else cooperates with them, because it can cause a lot of problems. I mean, on the one hand, it's good to publicize the plight of North Korean refugees, but on the other hand, if you publicize it too much, like what happened with Vietnam, you can have that road will be closed to future North Korean refugees. So it's difficult, especially as South Korea is very careful how they deal with China. They don't want to upset China too much. So that's why I think what South Korea needs to do is maybe not so public engagement, but quiet behind the scenes engagement, and support NGOs who are carrying out work to help North Korean refugees.
Okay, so Professor, this is the last question.
Okay.
So regarding the, in connection with what you have said, how do you think because you were prescribing some policy for the government, and then you were saying about these routes from North Korea going to a third party country and then to South Korea. So and then because I studied there in Korea from 2011 to 2014, and then I attended a church, and a Christian church, and then it's a common thing for Christian churches to have a ministry on North Korea, which are on the South Korea already, who already came to South Korea, and for those who are planning to escape from North Korea. And then there's also some non-government organization that like send paraphernalias to North Korea through balloons, right? And it was like on the news recently. So how do you think will non-governmental organizations like the churches or the other civil organizations in Korea might help the government, or might be integrated in the government towards the North Korean refugees policy?
Well, certainly the churches play a tremendously important role in facilitating the transition of North Korean refugees through third countries to South Korea. It's a little controversial in that I've spoken to some North Korean refugees who said that they were forced to convert by these church NGOs before they were granted assistance. So there are some issues there, but we mustn't underestimate the role that churches have played in bringing North Koreans safely to South Korea, or rescuing them from extremely hazardous conditions. The churches are probably the most active of the NGOs, also Buddhist organizations as well, though, but the religious organizations generally seem to be doing the most. So yes, they need to be encouraged to continue to do so, but maybe less of an emphasis on the religious aspect and more of an emphasis on the humanitarian aspect would help. That would also then enable the South Korean government to support them more, because it's technically a secular government. You know, there is no official state religion in South Korea. So it's always difficult if the government is seen as supporting one religion to the exclusion of other religions, especially as there's a roughly even divide between the Protestants, Catholics, and Buddhists in the country. So very important role to play. They've got to be careful how they play it. The propaganda in balloons to the north, also a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's good that the influx of South Korean material into North Korea has certainly helped North Koreans know that what their government's saying is propaganda, especially when it comes to the fact that most North Koreans have seen a Korean drama, for instance, South Korean drama. So they may also have a warped impression of South Korea, life in the South, that they think everyone drives a Lexus, but at least they no longer believe when their government is saying it's the poor people of Seoul who are starving to death, and we need to help the poor people in the South. They realize that's nonsense now. But on the other hand, it can serve to destabilize relations between North and South, which in the long term could actually have a negative impact on human security, and especially when it leads to tightening of border controls.
Okay, so I think that ends our Q&A session. So Professor, do you have any other message to our audience, or you can also promote again the one in your background?
Yes, absolutely. I would encourage everyone to log on for this conference. Details, I think I already posted details on the KISA and APISA Facebook page. I'd also encourage people once again to go to asianisr.org and download lots of articles from that site. We are currently processing articles for the next issue of Asian International Studies Review, which will be coming out in December. It is Scopus ranked, and it's also the official publication of both the Korea International Studies Association and one of the 5 official publications of the Asian Political and International Studies Association. Our conference will also be online in November, and that will also be free to all participants. So go to the Facebook pages to get more information.
Okay, thank you. So maybe Director Aldrin Lee could also say some words.
Hello, could you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right, so before we formally close today's session, I would like to apologize for my sudden disappearance from the live feed earlier. I'm actually using a prepaid Wi-Fi, and while it's really subpar as compared to wired connections, I did not expect it to act up right when I was delivering the opening remarks, so I sincerely apologize for that. In my interrupted remarks earlier, I have provided you a brief background about the previous editions of the Philippine Koreanist Congress, as well as an overview of this year's virtual third edition. Again, as mentioned by Dr. Laranjo in the start of the program, the next sessions will be held in the next 3 Fridays, so October 9, 16, and 23rd. So please follow the official Facebook page of the UP Korea Research Center for details regarding the next sessions. And before the interruption, I was also actually expressing our gratitude to the Academy of Korean Studies, who provided us grant to organize this year's Philippine Koreanist Congress. AKS was also, I believe, our funder in the first 2 editions of the conference. And I would like to thank the UP-KRC organizing team headed by the 3rd Philippine Koreanist Congress Project Director, Dr. Kyungmin Bae, for making all these possible. And thanks as well to the UP Diliman Computer Center, DILNet, for their assistance in all our virtual events thus far. And to our keynote speaker, Dr. Brendan Howe, thank you very much for your very informative talk. The insights that you have shared about the North Korean refugee integration policy in South Korea have been very enlightening, and I am confident that it would spark more interest among the Filipino Koreanists to look into this aspect of contemporary Korea more closely. And thank you very much as well to our resident fellow, Dr. Aaron Jed Rabena, for his intelligent response to Dr. Howe's keynote talk. And Ron Paksanim, to Dr. Ronel Aranjo, thank you very much for moderating the opening session of this year's Congress. And to all of you, thank you for choosing to join us today, and I hope that you will be with us again in the next 3 Fridays of October. As mentioned by Dr. Laranjo in the start of the program, today is the 3rd and the last day of Korea's Autumn Harvest Festival called Chuseok. So allow me to greet all our Korean colleagues and friends a happy Chuseok holiday 마음이 풍요로운 한가위를 보내시길 바랍니다. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe. 감사합니다.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Aldrin Lee. So before we go, I would just like to share to you the other um, events that we have in UPKRC. So this is our future events and the future lectures. So now we just finished the first session, so we still have three more sessions next on the next 3 Fridays of October. And on next Saturday, it is also the second Filipino speech contest for Koreans, which will be held from 1 to 3 p.m. So you can just visit UPKRC website and Facebook page for further instructions. And for our upcoming lectures, we have Professor Herman Joseph Kraft from the University of Philippines. He will be delivering a lecture entitled "The Role of ASEAN in Korean Peace Building Process." And the same, this will be on October 9th, and the same day will be Dr. Eric Capistrano delivering a lecture entitled From K-pop to Basketball, Sustaining Diplomatic Efforts Through Entertainment and Sports. And next, then the Friday after that, October 16, will be Dr. Ku Jong. He will be delivering a lecture entitled Policy and Perceptions Toward Korea, Towards Assimilation Approach. And the other speaker will be Professor Mark Isla of Far Eastern University. He will be delivering a lecture entitled A Comparative Study of Refugee Policies of the Republic of Korea and the Philippines. And for the last Friday will be Dr. Fernando Paragas of the University of the Philippines delivering a paper entitled A Critical Discourse Analysis of the Press Coverage and Online Discussion about the Two Koreas in Philippine Online News Sites. And Professor Michelle Correa from the Ateneo de Manila University delivering a lecture entitled Korean Drama Crash Landing on You and the Representation of Inter-Korean Relations. So for more information and updates, just visit www.facebook.com/UPKRC. 두루주셔서 감사합니다. Thank you for staying with us. 마raming salamat po. 다시 한번 추석 잘 보내세요. Happy 추석. 감사합니다. Salamat po.
Thank you very much. Dr. Howe, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Howe and Dr.